This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Abolish Rent, How Tenants Can End the Housing Crisis by Tracy Rosenthal and Leonardo Vilches. The social cost of rent is too damn high. Written for anyone fed up with the permanent housing crisis, Abolish Rent dissects our housing system from the perspective of those it immiserates. Through clear analysis and striking stories of resistance, it shows us how tenants can, through organizing and collective action, finally rebalance the scales. As Astra Taylor puts it, at once an insightful manifesto for a new housing paradigm that can provide shelter for every human being and a shrewd tactical guide, Abolish Rent can help us build a tenant-powered movement capable of winning the radical change we need. Find Abolish Rent at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is part 2 of what is now, surprise, surprise, a 3-part series on the history and present of Central America with Hilary Goodfriend and Jorge Cuéllar. Today, our interview picks up where we left off last time amid the revolutionary armed struggles against military-oligarchic regimes, struggles that took off in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. Those regimes responded with brutal violence against the people, aided and abetted by the United States. It was a counter-revolutionary foreign policy that took off with particular enthusiasm under the zealously anti-communist and evangelical Reagan administration. We then addressed the peace accords and post-war transitions that brought an end to the armed conflicts and established basic civil rights in the region. The post-war settlement, however, failed to address the underlying conditions that led to armed struggle in the first place. Worse yet, it was all accompanied by the imposition of brutal neoliberal economic restructuring that further deteriorated economic conditions. This new economic order, in turn, further accelerated the mass migration from the region initially unleashed by the civil wars. Ultimately, members of gangs formed in the U.S. were deported back into the region, leading to the explosion of gang violence that wreaked further havoc on countries that had never recovered from U.S.-sponsored armed conflicts in the first place. Then, in the final and third episode in this series that I'll be posting soon, we will survey the post-war trajectories of Nicaragua, Honduras, Panama, and Guatemala, and discuss how the mass migration fomented by U.S. policy has been rendered into a central scapegoat fueling far-right MAGA reaction here in the United States. Before we get started, we pay well nothing because we want everyone possible to listen to everything. The only way we can do that is because listeners like you voluntarily chip in to support us at patreon.com/thedig. If you believe in what we're doing, if The Dig matters to you, contribute now. We also have gifts to send you depending on where you live and how much you contribute, and all contributors get our newsletter emailed to you. If you believe this political education work is important, this is how to support us. Click the link in the show notes, patreon.com/thedig. Okay, here's Hilary Goodfriend and Jorge Cuéllar for part 2 of what is now a 3-part series. Hilary Goodfriend is a postdoctoral researcher with the Geography Institute at the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City. She's a member of the editorial committee of the North American Congress on Latin America, NACLA, an editor of the journal Latin American Perspectives, and a contributing editor at Jacobin Magazine. Jorge Cuéllar is professor of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies at Dartmouth College. He's an interdisciplinary scholar whose research and teaching focuses on the histories, politics, and daily life of modern Central America. Let's start the second episode just by briefly retracing some of the ground that we finished up covering last time. Briefly, can you break out each of these countries, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, and explain their distinctive revolutionary movements and how they really compared to each other organizationally, programmatically, and ideologically?
To begin with, it's important to recognize that the Guatemalan insurgency begins much earlier and has a much sort of more diverse and varied trajectory because of that, because it's so much longer than the other insurgencies in the region. In Guatemala, you have insurgent groups that are formed by a really diverse cohort over the years of, enterprising Mexican Trotskyists, dissident nationalist militarists, and of course, militant peasants and trade unionists from very different traditions who end up taking up arms against the military dictatorship that's installed, beginning with the 1954 CIA-backed coup that ends the process of the October Revolution and the Guatemalan Spring that we discussed previously. So in that way, the Guatemalan insurgency is consistently more, I think, heterogeneous and fragmented and dispersed, both territorially and maybe ideologically, over the course of the many decades that they are fighting in both the mountains and through urban guerrilla warfare in the cities. But of course, drawing on the same mass movement, student organizing, labor union organizing, and of course, rural worker organizing that guerrilla movements across the continent are using. In the case of Nicaragua, you have similarly a heterodox group of both nationalist and revolutionary leftists who come together in this sort of fusion of new and old left traditions. This is sort of common to the region in this period to defeat the Somoza dynasty, the US-backed Somoza dictatorship, and manage to do so in a relatively quick turnaround after some initial defeats in the 1960s as compared to their neighbors. Whereas in El Salvador, you have these distinct political military armed groups from equally diverse traditions, communist and more Maoist inspired. And as we've mentioned, of course, liberation theology is critical to all of these processes coming together to form a sort of Marxist-Leninist-led insurgency that ends up fighting a sort of prolonged popular struggle over the course of 12 years of civil war. So that's to sort of sketch out a little bit of what we're talking about in terms of these different groups. I think that new left, old left combination is really important when we think about this sort of old school communist party tradition, the Farabundo Martí, from which El Salvador's FMLN takes their name, together with this more heterodox left traditions inspired by the Cuban Revolution, radicalized even further by the failure of Allende's democratic project in Chile, and then further energized, of course, by the FSLN's 1979 victory. So that gives these insurgencies a particular flavor where they are neither orthodox Soviet puppets, nor are they social democratic reformers. They combine a lot of these different traditions.
So based on what we talked about in episode 1, like the sort of solidifying of a military oligarchic regime in most of these countries, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Honduras to some degree, the 20th century, it's largely defined by the consolidation of military oligarchic power around agro-export economies. And this does not change. This does not change throughout the 20th century. We get to the pressure cooker, right, of the 1980s, as Hilary just told us, thinking about ways to undo, right, to really kind of turn on its head this very cemented social and power structure that has defined most of these countries since their independence. And yes, there's a moment of these sort of liberal oligarchies are crumbling and no longer able to really contain the social stressors and the misery of Central American populations. And this is how you're getting closer to the 60s into the 70s with the failure of the CIA to contain what was the Guatemalan Spring and had to intervene in order to stop that. And that being a huge blow to reformist approaches, right? Institutional ways of instating social change in these countries. It really sort of made that a kind of dead end for Central America, that moment of the coup against Arbenz. And I think it inspires the guerrilla option in a little bit as well, right? This is where you have that forking path, the forking path of 54 that leads to 59, Cuban Revolution, right? And then the sort of feedback of that struggle into Central America once again, where you have the animating of other small guerrilla groups, the FMLN, the FSLN, the UNRG, right, which is this kind of loose coalition in Guatemala of various groups spread all throughout the Guatemalan countryside, but as well as in the urban core, the emergence of pan-indigenous groups, pan-Maya groups, right, who themselves are seeing this moment of revolutionary opening, right, because of this ossified social structure, that there needs to be a sort of different way of doing politics and to push Central America in another direction. What happens, of course, right, in the Guatemalan context is the longest internal conflict in the Americas. In El Salvador, you have a situation, what is a political stalemate, essentially, right, where a decisive victory cannot be won by the guerrilla forces or by the Salvadoran state backed by the United States. Honduras still remains a place of launching missions and counterinsurgency operations into these neighboring countries. And Nicaragua, right, stands alone as sort of the victorious entity, a political project through the Sandinistas that is able to take state power. This is not without complications, right? And many years where the Reagan administration attempts to discredit, dismantle, and make it challenging for the FSLN to do anything. But if it's the FSLN's internationalism in this moment too that allows them to govern, that creates various spaces for them to actually institute some transformations in Nicaraguan society. There's a foreclosure of an institutional transformative project in the sense of a kind of reformer or a redistributor, which Arbenz in some ways was going to be, right? So there was a foreclosure of that option, and the military option, this kind of direct confrontation with the inequalities that structure Central America, was the only way forward. This leads to these quite different national struggles, but that have that same root: agrarian inequality, of oligarchic rule, U.S. meddling and intervention, right, that pushes to the eruption of these revolutionary movements in the latter 20th century, right, that are very much ideologically, in many ways, while there is an ideological difference at the level of the cellular organizations that compose these radical movements, they're really positioned in a very direct way against imperialism, against that oligarchic structure that maintains a sort of feudal condition, right, in many of these countries, as well as the inability, right, of the political system to make room for any kind of reformist or political party-like movement.
These are national liberation movements that understand themselves as such, in this nationalist, but also very particularly third worldist idiom of the time. Political military, as well as political diplomatic structures that are forging international solidarities within the United States, but of course across the decolonizing and decolonized world, not just for military support, which is certainly critical for these tiny Central American guerrillas. Folks will travel to Vietnam for training. They will travel to Cuba. They will travel to Russia, to the Soviet Union. But also for political and educational and economic training, participating in these sort of like global forums, and what remains of like the non-aligned movement at that point as well. So I think it's important to understand these movements as some of the last expressions of that 20th century political moment, as Jorge is emphasizing.
What accounts for the absolutely perverse depravity, this performative sadism that's such a common feature of these US-backed repressive regimes, and also on the part of the Contras. It's a question that feels particularly relevant right now, watching what's happening in Gaza.
I think the brutality and scale of the slaughter with which these movements are met, it is astounding, and I think it is important to sort of reckon with and sit with. At the same time, it is not that unique. And I think that's also important too. A lot of the counterinsurgency, the strategy that is implemented in Central America, it's being implemented by Vietnam veterans. It's being implemented by Cuban exiles who also went to Vietnam and cut their teeth on the horrific counterinsurgency that was implemented there. It's also being aided by allied anti-communist regimes with horrific records of their own, from Argentina and Venezuela to, of course, Israel. So there's a way in which this colonial and counterinsurgent violence is recapitulated in the Central American theater in both a way to avenge the failures of the past, and then, of course, to prepare for future struggles that will be waged elsewhere in upcoming imperialist exercises. I think the continuities there are so critical, and they're not abstract. They're actually very much personified in the life trajectories of individuals who are part of the Reagan administration, the Bush administrations, the Trump administration, and many in between. So a lot of these sort of anti-communist cold warriors very much embody and incarnate this crusade that becomes very much central to the exercise of US military power and imperial power.
Yeah, to add a little bit to that, I mean, I want to talk specifically about just the level of the you said performative sadism, but the level of massacres that were sort of part of all these struggles. Like the numbers still cause a crisis in Central America, because people are never going to be able to find out exactly how many people were disappeared, were abducted, were killed, during these struggles. What we can see very clearly, right, is that the performative sadism of it all is that these things were meant to not only have an effect in the moment, this kind of punctual effect, right, a kind of punctual violence, but have a traumatic effect, a traumatic tail end to these societies. Not only was it about stomping out the communists in the moment, right, through this kind of intensified foreign policy of anti-communism, but if we look closely at what these actual policies ended up doing, it innovated what we now know as scorched earth. For example, precisely one of these things that was meant to not only eliminate, right, the guerrilla threat in the Guatemalan countryside or in the Salvadoran countryside, but was literally meant to destroy entire ways of living that were primarily campesino, poor, indigenous. It really had this deliberate, multi-layered, enduring effect in the kinds of lifeways and the lifestyles that people can have in Central America as a result of these things. And this, to me, is sort of that slow violence, so to speak, that I think allows us to think very directly with what's happening in Palestine, right? Precisely for that reason, that there are these moments of punctual violence that are spectacular. You have massacres of the scale of, 100,000 people, 30,000, 28,000, or whatever it is, thousands of civilians being disappeared every year, human rights abuses that are at this point sort of unquantifiable because of their scale. But it's this sort of latent effect of that violence that, to me, is part of the purpose. The brutality was the point, right? It was the point. The effect was to subdue Central America and Central American people and all imaginaries of liberation and transformation once and for all. They attempted to have this incredible impact through terror, uncertainty, right, that still lingers in the post-war and to the present. These places are no longer perceived to be hospitable to many people precisely because of the socio-political conditions that were established during these civil wars and these struggles that these countries still haven't come out from under, and that the political systems have never directly reckoned with. So not only is it those moments of incredible violence, where we have massacres in Rio Negro, Dos R's, Mozote, of course, right? All the violence of the Contras, right? About 30,000 people sort of die in the Contra War, but it's this latent effect that to me is precisely what these policies produced, and I think what was the point, to eliminate that possibility, that imaginary of transformation, and uproot it from the subsoil.
I also think it's really important to say that there's a way in which the nature of these atrocities, because they do appear to defy reason, it's easy to fall into this discourse of the irrationality of this violence. But of course, these were strategies and tactics that were implemented quite rationally. They were designed, they were codified in training manuals, they were imparted in US courses to Latin American troops and US forged special Latin American, Central American special forces and battalions at the School of the Americas. And they were dispatched systematically. And in the post-war period, especially with the processes of truth and reconciliation, often the official discourse embraces a framing of this irrational violence that sort of erupted out of nowhere, without history, without politics, without context, this sort of regrettable interruption of the liberal order that has now thankfully been restored through this national process of healing and what have you. But of course, these were very intentionally designed policies that were deployed to achieve precisely what Jorge is describing.
In one instance, like in Honduras, for example, in the 1980s, a lot of the aid that Honduras is receiving for developing its country, for building roads, for putting up lights, for all sorts of infrastructure, ports on the Caribbean coast, all these things are conditioned by Honduras having a very strong sort of counterinsurgency stance against what's happening around its borders with its neighbors. And so this is also a way that even one of the latent effects of this violence is in development of these countries, where much of what is established in the 1980s as a sort of political habit of these countries is having a really strong anti-communist counterinsurgent stance, allowing the state to be a vehicle in order to quell all dissent, and that being the reason that the military gets new weaponry, that being the reason why there's more employment, right? It's partly this conversation of restructuring that happens in the post-war, but really begins in the 1980s, where you have a lot of these efforts to get on the right side with the United States and to be on their good side, right? To not be subjected to the kinds of violence that we're talking about, is to be as anti-communist as them, to be as against that internal enemy as them. Sort of who is more counterinsurgent than the other becomes a really important measuring stick as to how politics is done in the 1980s and into the 1990s.
As you just mentioned, Hilary, Israel played a direct role in Central America, just as it played a direct role in backing apartheid South Africa. What's the exact Israel connection here?
I mean, I can say a few things about what Israel has been doing as well. I mean, a lot of it in Guatemala, for example, like it's really, really clear. A lot of the supplies that were coming into the state, to the military, was coming directly from Israel. Training, right? Counterinsurgency training. There was a sense that like what was happening in Palestine was very similar to the kind of internal enemy situation of the Guatemalan countryside with the indigenous Maya people. And so these kinds of this sort of calculus of internal and external threats was one of the also ideological similarities between Israel and Guatemala, and the reason why these strategic alliances came to be around the selling of weapons and training. There's also this moment as well, and this sort of gets into more contemporary things with Israel's role in Central America today, but Central America was also a market for the expanding Israeli arms and weapons manufacturing industry that was selling weapons to people all over Latin America, not only Central America, but Guatemala became one of its sort of main clients in this sense, no? So these countries that were embroiled in civil war were markets for the Israeli arms industry. And much of the weaponry that the Guatemalan military carried was Israeli stuff. On the other side, you have that the United States looked the other way that this was happening, right? For them, it was probably they were getting a discount essentially because they didn't have to provide those weapons to Central American countries. This was a moment where you could see that aid and strategy and these sort of strategic alliances between the Israeli arms industry with cash surpluses, and the Guatemalan military is able to sort of buy these weapons throughout the 1980s.
Absolutely. I think, and there's excellent reporting in the NACLA archives about this Israeli connection, and they have a recent issue about it that I would encourage listeners to check out. But in some ways, Israel is able to act as sort of an intermediary against restraints, congressional restraints, and what have you, human rights restraints that are placed on U.S. military aid to regimes like Guatemala in this period. But of course, Israel has its own autonomous, or at least relatively autonomous, interests in this period as well. And that sort of third worldist moment that I was describing a moment ago, of course, the Palestinian resistance is very much still part of that milieu in the 70s and through part of the 80s. So Israel is very much on the side of fighting against these national liberation movements, even as it's still managing to play this sort of game, this sort of coy, ingratiating itself with social democratic and left-leaning governments and movements worldwide, right? In Guatemala, these connections are so explicit, as Jorge is saying. There's the creation of the model villages that were used to sort of house and displaced indigenous Guatemalans, Mayans, who were driven from their communities that were raised by the Guatemalan military. Those are based precisely on Israeli tactics. They were developed with Israeli advisors. And you can find quotes from Salvadoran and Guatemalan military commanders in this period where they make that connection very explicit. And these connections continue through the post-war period when the region becomes vulnerable to forms of organized crime that I'm sure we'll touch on later. The Israeli private security industry is everywhere present throughout Central America. And here there are also some curious resonances with the kind of evangelical Christianity that is also becoming hegemonic precisely in this period as a response to liberation theology.
Maybe we could step back to return to the U.S. situation under the Reagan administration, something I discussed at great length with Grandin when I interviewed him about his book, Empire's Workshop. How did these wars both reflect and help to consolidate certain political coalitions in the U.S.? I think what first comes to mind are anti-communist zealots, but what might be less obvious to people is the role that the religious right played in all of this and the connections being forged between the religious right as a pillar of reactionary domestic politics in the United States and leaders like the Guatemalan genocidaire Efraín Ríos Montt.
Well, as Grandin argues, the Central American theater provides the new right with an arena in which to unite both the neocons with the far-right nationalists and, of course, the Christian evangelicals into a coalition that proves sufficiently robust to elect Reagan and really sort of continue to shape politics in the U.S. as we know it. The question of evangelical Christianity is really important. It actually begins much earlier with Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, dispatching missionaries to the region in a way that often backfires. many of these young, impressionable missionaries who are sent to preach the American way of life, free market and democracy and reformism, of course, at the same time these same policies are arming these militaries to the teeth and creating paramilitary structures that will assassinate many of these same reformers that they claim to be training. But these missionaries, many of them are radicalized by the inequalities and the poverty and the repression that they witness firsthand in the region. An excellent example is missionary Mara Clark, who was one of the 4 U.S. churchwomen who is assassinated by the Salvadoran National Guard in 1980. She was a missionary who was a Maryknoll missionary in Nicaragua who ended up supporting the Sandinistas and is martyred in El Salvador, and was very active in the solidarity movement and a very fierce advocate against U.S. intervention in the region. This strategy of deploying Protestant evangelical Christianity in particular as a sort of antidote to what is perceived as, communist liberation theology, it has a long trajectory. And throughout the 1980s, you have the likes of Pat Robertson, who are instrumental in moralizing the New Rights Project in the region and bringing back some of the moral high ground, allegedly, to the U.S. imperial product, like sanctifying not just counterinsurgency, but of course the free market and the profit motive. And that's really what sets the stage for today's prosperity gospel and the evangelical churches that flourish now in this franchise form throughout the most immiserated and abandoned rural and urban regions of Central America, much in the same way that criminal gangs have. So in that sense, I think it's really important to recognize the role of this particular form of Christianity in this New Right project that is sort of being forged in this moment.
Yeah, to add a little bit to that, there's also in the Guatemalan case, like the role of US-based evangelical churches that are part of this incredible support for Reagan's policies in the region, the expansion, right, of evangelical Christianity and what will then become the mega churches in Central America in this period. They see an ally, right, with these authoritarian figures, like you mentioned, Dan Rios Montt, right, whose Protestantism and whose evangelical Christianity is itself sort of an ally, right, in this scramble for souls in Central America that evangelical Christians, right, evangelical Protestantism is very much interested in expanding, no? So fundamentalist groups in the U.S. were very key, right, in supporting the provision of military aid by Reagan, by Carter, by various U.S. presidencies in Guatemala and in El Salvador, right, where evangelical beliefs become a kind of justifying force for the immense repression and the brutality against the communist liberation theologians, right, and the radical Catholic Church. Like Hilary mentioned, sort of there's a moral impetus, right, that's happening here, where you have groups like, I remember Gospel Outreach was one of them, for example, in the United States, that was pushed for, in the wake of scorched earth policies, we need to build out churches. There's souls there that need saving. And so that sort of dialectic of displacement and repression that produces the spaces for evangelical Christianity to step in and offer a kind of moral remedy to these issues, where liberation theology in the Catholic Church appears to be too far gone, so to speak, right? And so this becomes a method by which social control is then re-exerted, right? Not only from the violence of the military and those governments, but even moral discourse becomes a justifying force, right, to make sense of what is really senseless. And Rios Montt is here a clear example, and Oscar Mejia Vitores, who's right after, right? These guys all follow the same playbook, where authoritarianism requires evangelical Christianity as its handmaiden, right? This is the only way that the brutality, right, and the scale of the repression that's happening in the 1980s can be justified. We need a moral discourse to smooth it over. And evangelical Christianity steps into that void.
We should take account of the Mosquito indigenous people who played an important role in the U.S.-backed Contra War. These are a people who inhabit the Mosquito Coast, a region a region of Nicaragua that for much of its history was dominated by the British. How did the conflict between the Mosquito and Sandinista government develop to the point that it did? And to what extent were those patterns rooted in longer histories dating back through the Somoza regime and even before that, all the way back to the region's time as a British protectorate? And then what exactly did the Mosquito role in the Contras, this counter-revolutionary proxy force? What did it look like?
So the history of the Mosquito Coast, especially as it is connected to U.S. influence in the region, really begins even before the Sandinista Revolution. Some of these missionaries that Hilary was mentioning, the U.S. Peace Corps, CIA, Voice for America type radio stations broadcasting from the Mosquito Coast. There's all these connections between that Mosquito Caribbean coastline and attempts to jeopardize central governments in the region. And Nicaragua here is sort of a case in point. And the mosquitoes themselves have what's interesting is not only are they used by the United States in different kinds of ways for counterinsurgency and counter-revolutionary activities, but they also, we have to remember that they have their own sense of and desire for autonomy and self-determination that's really against the centralizing government of Leon, the elites in Leon, the elites in Managua. They're really not about this settler colonial project that's coming from the Pacific side, which is where the sort of cradle of Nicaraguan state power is located. And so there's a sense that the Mosquitos are themselves playing geopolitics in different ways, right, in order to seek out their own desires, right, and to realize their own political objectives. But they become subsumed in these larger geopolitical Cold War kinds of projects where they're used as the base of operations in the way that Honduras is to destabilize the central government. But this is also part of that long colonial relationship with elites in Managua and Leon in the Pacific Coast, and this sort of black, indigenous, and underdeveloped countryside that is represented by the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. And the Mosquito themselves are regionalists, nationalists. They're the ones who then broker deals with the Sandinista government to create the autonomous zones that are one of the first forms of self-determined indigenous leadership. That's something that's brokered with the Sandinistas, right? Because it demonstrates that they're political actors in their own right, and they've been doing this back and forth for quite a long time, since before the founding of the Nicaraguan state. And so these communities are incredibly important to the telling of modern Nicaragua and become political actors in their own right, sometimes against revolutionary governments, sometimes against a military regime. But it's this there's an internal dynamic in Nicaragua that gets a little lost if we don't pay close attention to the particularity of this ethnic group that has always existed on the margins of the Nicaraguan nation state. There are attempts by the Sandinistas to work with them, right, to imagine these other forms of governance, sort of co-governance. There's a social agenda geared towards developing that Caribbean side of the country. But it's the CIA that plays on these internal differences, right, playing those dynamics within the country against one another, that also breaks down a lot of those conversations that are happening with the Sandinistas and the Mosquito, then placing them in a sort of role of being these kind of counterinsurgent forces and being part of the sort of contra effort to discredit what the Sandinistas are doing. And case in point, there's this organization called, I think, Misurasata, which means Mosquito, Sumu, Rama, and Sandinistas working together. And this organization is precisely an emblem of the possibility of Sandinista, Mosquito, and indigenous cooperation in the moment post of the revolution. And it's that kind of organizational capacity that is attacked by the CIA, and ideological wedges are placed in those groups, right, in order to dismantle them and to make them impossible to exist. Those wedges become even wider and wider, right, that then make it seem that the Mosquito themselves and indigenous populations are not for the revolution. They're actually counter-revolutionaries. And there's also policies in the United States at this point where they're perceived to be sort of for indigenous rights, right, in ways that is not what the Sandinistas are doing in this period. And this is a huge moment that's taking place in Nicaragua. There's also many Mosquito refugees in places like Honduras that end up joining the Contra forces. And they end up joining the Contra forces sometimes for ideological reasons because of internal issues in Nicaragua, but also at the same time because it puts food on the table. There are these situations of how the Miskito get caught up in a geopolitical drama that they think is a sort of a national one, but it becomes much, much, much wider.
As we've mentioned a few times, Honduras was a critical staging ground for U.S. operations across the region, including as the operations center for the Contra War. Meanwhile, Costa Rica was economically subsidized by the U.S. for supporting the Contra War until the election to the presidency of Oscar Arias, who ran on a political program of anti-war neutralism. Meanwhile, Panama was led by Omar Torrijos, a left-leaning military ruler who came to power in a 1968 coup and who negotiated the return of the Panama Canal with Jimmy Carter until he suddenly died in a plane crash in 1981, and a man named Manuel Noriega established his military regime and works as a CIA asset until the U.S. invasion, which we will get to later on. What was going on in the region more broadly, particularly in these neighboring countries in Central America that weren't themselves directly consumed by armed rebellion and mass repression? How did Central American states relate to each other during this era of U.S.-backed war?
With regards to Honduras, Honduran social movements were also met with counterinsurgent violence in this period. Honduras has its own martyrs and disappeared in this period. Many people from Honduras also participated in the insurgent movements in neighboring countries. Berta Cáceres, who was assassinated in 2016, the indigenous and feminist movement leader in Honduras, she actually participated with members of her family in the 1989 final offensive in El Salvador that set the stage for the peace negotiations that ended the war in 1992. So just to say that these are very porous borders. They're very close societies. A lot of folks have family on both sides of these borders. And so, of course, it's hard to draw a clean line between these societies then as now. Costa Rica was a critical place of solidarity with the Sandinista revolution, despite the government's participation in the Contra War. Many revolutionaries found periods of exile in Costa Rica. And so there's a way in which there's a lot of circulation of militants through the region. And of course, obviously, Nicaragua under the Sandinistas is a really important space for the region's insurgent leaders and wounded to be recovering, to be meeting and planning and taking shelter. Costa Rica, of course, emerges as a critical broker for peace negotiations in the late 1980s under Arias in a way that helps create the frameworks that will eventually find a negotiated end to the armed conflicts that failed to seize power in both Guatemala and Honduras. And in that way, it plays this sort of ambiguous role as both a supporter of the counterinsurgency and a broker of peace and an advocate for peace in the region.
And, to say a little bit about Nicaragua and Panama, what's happening in Panama at this point, I like to think about this through the story of Hugo Spadafora, a medical doctor, a Panamanian medical doctor who goes to Guinea-Bissau and is in the guerrilla struggle with Amílcar Cabral, right, in Guinea-Bissau, and all of this. He returns to Panama in the 1970s. He attempts to do political activity in Panama in order to produce transformation, right, in order to get rid of the United States, in order to develop this sort of argument that will then culminate in flag riots and in the pushing out of the U.S. from the Canal Zone. Spadafora joins the Sandinista revolution. He joins the Sandinista revolution in a Panamanian brigade. I can't remember the name, Lorenzo Brigade, I think is what they're called, in the Sandinista revolution that is sort of untold, but it's precisely of this internationalism that's happening in the moment. And as Hilary mentioned, these porous borders where does Nicaragua end and Panama begins, and where does Costa Rica start and Honduras begin? These movements are so fluid and so dynamic and so fast. And somebody like Spadafora then becomes a real key player in the Torrijos project that will come in later in Panama. But there's an incredible internationalism in this period at the same time that there is this incredible counterinsurgent effort by the United States and by governments that are themselves allied with those efforts. No, but the figure of Spadafora to me is precisely one of these kind of Che Guevara-like figure, a medical doctor, becomes a guerrilla, has this incredible transformation in his political consciousness, and then uses those lessons in a revolutionary context in Central America.
That internationalism is so important. These are very much regional conflicts, and not just because of the U.S. intervention and the way in which the U.S. is leveraging them into this sort of like world historic geopolitical significance, but because the entire region is being recruited both into revolution and counter-revolution. The wars are sort of inescapable throughout Central America, but they're also magnets for international solidarity, both armed and civilian, from across Latin America, North America, and far beyond. There are internationalists fighting in Nicaragua and in Guatemala and certainly in El Salvador, from Mexico, from Argentina, from Europe, medical workers, aid workers who are joining the struggle in various capacities. They very much become the center of left internationalism as well as this sort of far-right anti-communist international that is also forged there.
Before we move on, can you lay out briefly the regimes in power and the roles they're playing in Honduras, Panama, and Costa Rica? There's a change in Panama with the end of the Torrijos regime and Noriega coming to power. In Costa Rica, there's Oscar Arias coming to the presidency in 1986 on a platform of neutrality. And then Honduras, again, is this key U.S. garrison state from which the U.S. is running its bloody anti-communist proxy wars all over the region.
So Omar Torrijos in Panama, he comes to power as a military leader. He's a general. Through a coup, he ends up becoming president of Panama, right, and brokering the deal with Jimmy Carter, December 31st, 1999. Never going to forget that date. And this is a really interesting moment in Panamanian history because it now puts on the agenda, right? The possibility or the eventual possibility of getting rid of U.S. presence in the region. This doesn't happen quite as smoothly as Torrijos, like you mentioned, Dan, right, is killed in a freak plane crash in the same way that this guy that I mentioned, Hugo Spadafora, he also dies in a plane crash. Very interesting. In El Salvador, we have plane crashes too. And it's in this period where Torrijos' incredible popularity from the 1980s and 1990s, you have the emergence of another character, right, within his ranks. Part of the Panamanian army is somebody who actually represents a new kind of politician for Central America, right? A CIA asset, School of the Americas trained goon, Manuel Pineapple Face Noriega. This guy is a very interesting figure in the sense that his rise is through the coattails of the populism garnered by Torrijos, this sort of nationalist. We're going to take back the canal. We're going to implement some level of social reform, right? This kind of thing. Torrijos himself is a very complicated figure because he does also stamp out a lot of dissent and naysayers in his midst. And, many people would claim it's an authoritarian regime as well. But he has a very vexed sort of legacy. Noriega sort of continues some of this, but he begins to make it a little more extreme in the sense that he begins to disappear people, outwardly violent ways of clamping down dissent. But Noriega is sort of in the model of a Torrijos, this kind of populist nationalist leader that plays this moment extremely well. And what I mean by him being a kind of new politician, it's in the sense that he's also building on some of the non-aligned connections that Torrijos has in this moment in order to garner support, international support for the eventual returning of the canal. And yes, this is an anti-imperial struggle. Panama needs to be free from the yoke of colonialism. So Noriega plays up this kind of thing, but he also has connections to the CIA, to Bush, to all these kinds of characters. He's pretty much the darling of George H.W. Bush's CIA. And eventually, it's found that he's also connected to emerging economies and interests coming from further south in the Americas, right, from Colombia, with the emergence of narco trafficking. And Noriega takes a piece of this, no? He's in a strategic location where commodities have always flown through, right? And so he takes a little bit of this and becomes connected and linked to the drug trafficking economy. But to me, this is an incredible transition where from the turning over the canal to Panamanian hands and the emergence of the drug economy and Noriega as a kind of broker between this new regional phenomenon and these shifting of powers in Southern Central America, it creates a kind of moment of a double whammy where you have the emergence of the drug economy and people like Noriega as these brokers, right, that become problematic and that inspire a kind of regime change approach, again, from the United States that we hadn't seen for some time at this point, right? In 89, we hadn't seen anything like that. And with the justifying reason, right, that it's because this is a narco dictator, essentially, right? A word that will come to connect to Honduras and other places later on. And the Noriega moment becomes a sort of archetype of this, a sort of model of this. In other countries through the 80s into the 90s, Costa Rica, for example, like this is very much connected to the Israelis in this moment, turning to Israel for assistance, for not for military aid, but for security aid. And that's different in the sense that Costa Rica doesn't have a standing army in the traditional sense, but they have police officers. They have a security apparatus. It just doesn't look in as a kind of a mounted military in the way that it does for other countries. And they're also in this kind of Israeli network of buying weapons and understanding how to quell dissent and to run a quote unquote democracy. And so during the presidency of Luis Alberto Monge in the mid 80s, this is what's happening, right? When we get to the late 1980s, towards 1990, with Oscar Arias that you mentioned, right? He's a very important figure in Central American history broadly because of his role in initiating conversations around peace processes in the region, right? So attempting to stop the bloodshed. This is where you get to the Esquipulas peace process, right? Which gets him the Nobel Prize, I believe, in like 87, 88. But it's precisely this moment, right, where the role of a relatively stable Costa Rica is to help the diplomatic process to bring closure to these open conflicts. And this is relatively unsuccessful because of the crusaders of the United States and continually funneling cash into the region in order to keep these conflicts going, in order to secure what they thought at this point they could realize, right? Which was a decisive victory, which in the end we know that is impossible. And so Oscar Arias was one of these luminaries, a kind of peace luminary in Central America in his attempts to, or in his recognition, rather, that there was no way out of these conflicts without a serious negotiation and diplomatic resolution. Belligerence in the way that it had been happening for the last 10 years at this point had no end in sight.
That drug connection that becomes the pretext, at least for invading Panama in 1989 and ousting Noriega, is of course not a coincidence. The illicit connections of U.S. intelligence agencies are not incidental, they're structural, because of course the CIA and these intelligence groups that are orchestrating this covert counterinsurgency require black markets to move cash and weapons and commodities outside of official channels. And so they turn to all kinds of networks of organized crime, including, mafias of Cuban exiles out of Miami. And of course, these emergent Colombian narco trafficking networks. It's no small thing, especially considering how further U.S. anti-drug strategies in the region convert Central America into such a critical corridor for the drug trade and the devastating fallout of that. I think it's also important to think about how at this period of time, there's a class recomposition process at play in Central America and elsewhere as these agro-export economies are slowly becoming incorporated into the new neoliberal accumulation regime. Costa Rica has its first debt crisis at the beginning of the 1980s, and it's actually Arias who eventually comes back to sort of tarnish his own legacy and brings Costa Rica into the Central American Free Trade Agreement, despite massive popular protests and public opinion against it. In El Salvador as well, there are shifts in the ruling coalition from the sort of more recalcitrant landowning oligarchy towards their more transnational, financialized cousins and nephews and whatnot. Political electoral vehicles of the ruling class will shift accordingly, right? In Honduras, you have a shift from standard military rule to this sort of like brokered power sharing agreement between the national and liberal parties, like trading off power. It's an interesting moment of contestation in terms of what the dominant accumulation patterns will be, what will the role of the region be in the new international division of labor that's emerging, and that's very much at stake in these conflicts, and which the peace process that figures like Arias are so critical in brokering will eventually settle.
So from the 70s with, I think it's Policarpo, General Policarpo, it's a series of military leaders in Honduras. This is where the rapid modernization of the Honduran military happens through the 60s all the way into the late 80s. And a lot of the political leadership is coming from the military ranks in Honduras. And so this might demonstrate a little bit of the predispositions, right, of Honduras as a nation state to accept the support of the United States and to allow the country to be used as a sort of base of operations for counterinsurgency. But it's from Policarpo to Roberto Suazo to Ascona del Hoyo, right, into the 1990s, the country is dominated by militaristic interests. And these militaristic interests are often tied with that same landed oligarchy, right, that we'll come to find out later, like the Facuses, right? All these kinds of folks are very much tied up with these governments, right? And a lot of the benefits that they derive for their own greed, essentially, in the expansion of their business operations is done through these 1970s, 1980s governments in Honduras that are militaristic to the bone, that are supported by the United States, and that whose aid is conditioned by allowing Honduras to be a site of surveillance for the revolutions happening around them. A sort of model in Honduras that you can see in part in Panama too, in the way that Panama is also doing some of this intelligence gathering, that it becomes a sort of mode by which governments from Central America can offer something in return for all the military aid that they're receiving from the United States. We offer you information on these communist parties that are sort of trying to emerge in our countries, and let's snuff them out. This is the kind of thing that in the 80s and into the 90s, many Central American governments are playing into. They're playing this role with the United States, but Honduras is sort of the crown jewel, also because of its central location in northern Central America, right? It's a pretty sizable country relative to El Salvador and Costa Rica, right? It's really, really big. It's a strategic location for military operations, but it's U.S. militarism by invitation. And they want this because this is a path for the development of Honduras, and the military is seen as a determinant force in the region. And I think in most countries of Central America, the military still is kind of the arbiter of political contests throughout the 20th century in many cases. But in Honduras, it's much more clear in the sense that this isn't challenged by any mass movement in quite the same way as it is in other countries nearby.
I think also Honduras is able to play that role or is chosen to play that role, in part because, as Jorge mentioned, of its size, but also it is relatively sparsely populated, certainly compared to a country like Guatemala, which is also quite, larger. And it doesn't have the consolidated landed oligarchy that El Salvador and Guatemala have, that create sometimes competing nationalist interests that might come up against US designs for the region. Honduras, from very early on, is under the thumb of these transnational monopolies like United Fruit. It is the banana republic. And so, because the ruling class is not united in the same way as elsewhere in the region, the military and a very much a US sort of allied and dependent military is able to play this critical role in the region.
One thing that we forgot to mention about Honduras, its long-standing relationship with United Fruit Company and the symbiotic relationship with U.S. foreign capital and the Honduran state that also makes it more amenable to U.S. foreign policy more generally. And so that's precisely one of the reasons that Honduras is receptive to it being, the USS Honduras and the base of operations for counterinsurgency. That relationship with United Fruit really establishes a lot of the networks of political influence in Honduras that go very, very deep.
The brutal US-backed repression and the resulting massive migrant exodus sparked these interlinked Central America solidarity and refugee sanctuary movements in the United States. Mass movements that supported revolutionary struggles across the region, opposed U.S. intervention, and that organized for the rights of migrants being driven from their homes. At this moment now, when we've seen renewed internationalist solidarity politics that's come about around Palestine, what should we know about and what should we learn from the Central America solidarity and sanctuary movements? And Hilary, I believe you worked for one of these major solidarity organizations that still exists today. And I sort of worked for them too. CISPAS. I worked for the Portland Central America Solidarity Committee, which was a CISPAS chapter way back in the day. And you worked at CISPAS's San Salvador office.
That's right, Dan. I think both of our first jobs out of college were for CISPAS or CISPAS adjacent groups. The Central America Solidarity and peace movement and sanctuary movements cannot be divorced from the national liberation struggles of the times. The US government went to great lengths to try and smear these movements as organic to and subordinate to armed struggles and insurgents. And I don't want to make that claim particularly, but certainly these are movements that were deliberately organized by Central American exiles and militants in the US strategically in different sectors to achieve political goals at the same time as they autonomously attracted solidarity activists from across North America. But they were very much deliberately organized in the sense that to organize, on the one hand, Central American exiles and refugees into a political bloc that could advocate both in solidarity with the liberation movements with which they may have sympathized, but in particular against US intervention and, of course, more urgently for immigration reforms that would allow them to make their lives in the United States. But in parallel, North American activists were also organized separately into a solidarity movement, specifically to put pressure on the US government and advocate against the interventionist policies that were wreaking havoc on Central America in this period. And so these sort of different constituencies were very much mobilized deliberately, strategically by these very politically savvy movements in Central America to help achieve their goals. And of course, they became a political home for a US left that was very much adrift in the post sort of Vietnam, post 68 moment after the horrific repression of the 1970s and COINTELPRO had really ravaged so much of the US left. These solidarity movements became sort of a last bastion of this third worldism and a place for these new left sort of refugees, right? And then, of course, over time, a place for younger left activists like Dan and myself to also become, radicalized and have our own sort of political experiences. But I frame it in this way because when we talk about the solidarity movement, we're talking about several different movements, right? There's the sanctuary movement, which is very much a movement of refugees. It's very much tied to the church, and it's very much oriented around immigration policy because, of course, as refugees of US allied governments, these migrants, these exiles are not being recognized for asylum because to do so would be to recognize the atrocities that are being committed with US tax dollars by these governments. And then there's also the movement for solidarity, which is both a movement in solidarity with these national liberation movements and sort of a front through which to combat US intervention in the region.
And those are groups like CISPIS, which is the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, NICANET, the Nicaragua Network, and NISQUA.
Yeah, the sanctuary movement is so fascinating and very complex. Has there's the interfaith element to it, right? With different churches, the Quaker communities, anti-Vietnam, right? Anti-war, civil rights movements that also feed into that. And I think the sanctuary movement looks different in different locales, depending on what is a pre-existing struggle there, pre-existing advocacy and mutual aid struggle in a particular location. So, for example, in the Midwest, in places where there was the Underground Railroad or something, right, a lot of the sanctuary movement is built on top of those layers of organizing past. In places like Los Angeles, for example, this is where you have like the establishing not only of groups like CISPIS, but the other one, like the Central American Refugee Center, CARECEN, which is an incredible organization that it's really about, it's about mutual aid, right? It's about material aid to refugees coming to the United States, right? And helping them get a grip on what they're experiencing as the newly displaced and the new arrivals to a whole new world, right, in the United States. And so what's so interesting here is that things like Carecen, right, Clínica, Oscar Romero, El Rescate, all these organizations are to me, very, very Salvadoran in the sense that, like, in El Salvador, there's an incredible associational culture, let's put it, where, you, me, and Hilary, we're a group, we share some ideas, let's form an organization, and it's very sort of from the ground up, very grassroots, right? And so that associational culture is also performed and practiced in transnationalism when people are displaced, when people arrive to the places that they get to, and it sort of links up and makes a sort of hybrid with pre-existing struggles. So, for example, in Los Angeles, a lot of what Sanctuary was about was finding people jobs, finding people things to do. And that becomes a sort of another way of offering financial, practical support, essentially, right, to people. But at the same time, there's an incredible recognition within that space of quote-unquote sanctuary of the incredible violence of the U.S., right, in being sort of the prime mover of the displacement and the reason that they even have to sort of do these kinds of things in the United States, right? But really, it's clear that what they were all about is exposing those U.S. policy contradictions. And this is where it connects to some of the things that Hilary said, right? Putting pressure on the U.S. government and having a sort of united front of political dissent against the warmongering in Central America. And so that was one of the key parts, but it's not accurate to say that everybody in the sanctuary movement was politicized to the level of a militant as well, right? They were ordinary people who were simply connecting culturally with other people trying to make a living. And this happened through these incredible organized vehicles, right? Like CISPES, like Carecen, right? That put people in touch with the resources that they needed to survive, and to find the kinds of connections to find belonging, right, in a place like New York or Portland or whatever, right? that had a leadership structure that often came from people who had experiences of organizing in Central America, but not exclusively. Oftentimes it was other people, and it was also, had leaders from like Puerto Rico, from other groups as well, African Americans, of course, too. But it provided a kind of a grouping, right, a kind of umbrella in order to present these atrocities that were happening in Central America and organize around them in order to challenge, right, and shift U.S. policy, which became migrant advocacy in the end, because that was precisely the fruits that came out of all this intervention and violence in the 80s.
And these groups were the target of significant government repression and destabilization, interference, surveillance, and harassment from, CISPES to, the Archdiocese of LA. Organizations had their offices broken into, they had files stolen, people were followed, people were kidnapped. CISPES was under FBI investigation for several years in the 1980s. So there was very much a COINTELPRO style strategy to try and infiltrate and destabilize these groups as well. I think in reference, Dan, to your sort of invocation of the present moment, one of the reasons that I stress the connections that these groups had to very varying degrees with these national liberation struggles is that I think that that's one critical element that is missing in today's internationalist landscape. Many of these organizations, the ones that did survive, like CISPES, they did so because they were able to maintain relationships with social movements and structures in Central America. But those formations could only survive on those terms to the degree that their allies in El Salvador were able to do the same. And of course, the neoliberal landscape and post-neoliberal landscape of today is quite different. And that creates a different context for the kinds of internationalism that can come together. I think it's also important to say that many of these groups that did survive were able to do so because whatever that initial moment that was very sort of sectorialized and compartmentalized in terms of mobilizing different cohorts to different means strategically in the 1980s, the distinctions between these like refugee communities and U.S. citizens become increasingly blurred as these diasporas are so well established in the United States. And certainly I think a group like CISPES has sought at least to be a space for diaspora organizing as well, but that's always a very fraught dynamic.
Hi, this is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
This episode, like every episode of The Dig, is produced in partnership with Jacobin Magazine. Jacobin is an incredible publication. You've probably seen a lot of what they've published online, but they also have a beautiful print magazine. It comes out quarterly and has well over 100 pages packed with illustrations, infographics, and some of the best graphic design in the country. Dig listeners can join 50,000 Jacobin subscribers developing socialist political thought and debate for just $15 a year. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's entire back catalog. If you've never subscribed to Jacobin before, you can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin. The decade ended with negotiations to end the Civil War underway, and also with the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama, an invasion to overthrow, arrest, and extradite Manuel Noriega. Noriega, as we've discussed, had been a major CIA asset and exploited the populist energies around his rather different predecessor, Torrijos. Why did the U.S. invade Panama and turn on their one-time ally? And what does that military intervention reveal about the broader changing shape of U.S. power in the region, and also globally, how it was evolving at the end of the Cold War, during the early years of the war on drugs, in the lead up to the first Gulf War, and George H.W. Bush's ominous proclamation of a new world order?
Okay, so Noriega is such an interesting character in the contemporary story of Central America because he represents the sort of entanglement of so many different kinds of interests from the mid to the late 20th century and emerging interests, geostrategic interests for the United States. What's clear here is that despite what's happening in other civil conflicts, right, in El Salvador and in Guatemala, the United States still wants to project power and assert its sort of role as a regional hegemon in Central America. And this becomes a reason to do so, right? Panama has always been formally occupied by the United States militarily, right? There are still bases in Clayton in Panama today. There is that kind of intimate connection of colonialism with Panama and the United States. And so to allow Noriega to so openly defy the United States and was seen as not permissible. Noriega simply knew too much as well, right? He simply was caught in a web of counterintelligence that, similarly to the kind of scandal that the Reagan administration experiences with Iran-Contra, Bush seemed to also be in a kind of situation where this might escalate to that degree. And so the only way to prevent Noriega from continually consolidating his power in Panama and installing himself as a dictator for the long term, right, was to not only at first back another candidate in Dada and win elections, right, against Noriega. Noriega refuses to step down because he says that that's an illegal election that's bought by the United States, right, and he annuls them. And this becomes, again, another sort of element in the United States' calculus that Noriega is digging his heels in. What they do, right, in order to have Noriega step down forcefully at first, right, is obviously discussions, apparently, negotiations. But then one of the things that the Bush administration does is in December of 1989, right? This is I believe like a week before Christmas or something like this. They bomb this neighborhood called El Chorrillo in Panama City, which is primarily poor, Black, working class people who are perceived to be the base that supports Noriega the most and is harboring him in order to prevent that extradition that Bush had been calling for. This becomes one of the most bloody scenes of the invasion. It still lingers in Panamanian memory. There's this incredible film by Abner Benaim about this traumatic episode and the way it still lingers in Panamanian consciousness. Where were you on the day of the invasion kind of thing? Incredible film. The interest of getting Noriega out were, for many people, right, still very complicated and very controversial because many people still don't believe that Noriega was a drug trafficker, that he was doing anything politically manipulative, and in fact was actually a very well-supported populist. A lot of people still revere Noriega in Panama. But this is, again, for many people seen as how the United States will not let the Central American nations determine their own political futures, right? And 1989 appears as this kind of turning point. They throw everything at Noriega to discredit him, and because they can't get rid of him, they bomb the country, right, in attempts to scare him into submission. And Noriega doesn't go quietly, right? He ends up being harbored by the Vatican embassy for some weeks, and there's all these incredible scenes of, them playing sort of Van Halen or Metallica, really loudly in order to sort of psychologically damage the guy and get him to turn himself in, just this incredible sort of pressure just to get him to step down. But these measures fail, and eventually he turns himself in, and then he's tried in U.S. court for narco trafficking, and eventually is extradited back to Panama, where he dies. But this episode of the invasion, right, it comes in that long history of U.S. having a sense of ownership over Panama.
To sort of put that episode also in some broader context, the invasion of Panama in 1989 comes after the 1983 invasion of Grenada, which I think is really critical and also sort of reinforces or gives credence to the perception by Central American revolutionaries that the threat of U.S. invasion was very real and was very present. And there was a sense that at any moment, the U.S. would give the order and they'd have boots on the ground in El Salvador or in Nicaragua to a greater extent than they already did. By December 1989, the Berlin Wall has fallen. And so it's also sort of inaugurating this new post-Cold War moment. And the US is preparing to sort of redeploy, having sort of regrouped in Central America throughout the 1980s. The very mediatized invasion of Panama is followed by the Gulf War and the whole shock and awe televised spectacle of that intervention. And so it's also sort of a critical precedent for this very aggressive redeployment of US imperialist military power abroad as well.
How did the civil wars in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador end? And how did the way that they ended shape the future of the region? In other words, what sort of political and economic orders did the Civil War settlements impose? The new order was of course neoliberalism. That's what happens basically everywhere. But neoliberalism always takes on local and national characteristics. What was Central American neoliberalism? What was the form of neoliberalism that took root in these countries that had just undergone so many years of revolution and bloody repression? And then lastly, what's the relationship of the peace accords and the transitions to democracy on the one hand and the imposition of neoliberalism on the other? Is the former reducible to the latter, or is it more complex?
The transition to democracy that is also a transition of neoliberal restructuring in Central America takes very different forms in the countries in which it's implemented, and it happens unevenly. It happens in different time periods according to when peace agreements are brokered. In El Salvador, that's 92. In Nicaragua, it's after the Sandinistas lose the 1990 elections. In Guatemala, it's not until 1996. And elsewhere in the region, it's a little bit earlier. But broadly speaking, we're talking about, a new dependent insertion of the region in the international division of labor and the new globalized neoliberal economy as essentially labor reserves, cheap labor reserves for what is increasingly a US-dominated global economy. Central America is sort of refashioned into a platform for low-wage maquiladora exports, manufacturing ensemble exports, as well as, of course, extractive economies for raw materials. And, of course, labor reserves in the sense of the mass export of all of these working majorities that are depossessed and displaced by neoliberal restructuring and driven into the deindustrializing US economy, where they can be exploited in the lowest segments of a booming service sector, principally. This happens not just in Central America, but of course in Mexico. So the migration pattern that emerges is very much part of this broader accumulation pattern that emerges across the region, in which you have low-wage exports from manufacturing platforms in the maquiladora sector on the one hand, and of course, the mass movement of low-wage workers into US labor markets whose remittances will subsidize this entire system by providing foreign reserves to restructured Central American governments and critically income to these impoverished households in order to just maintain reproduction of the entire thing. That's broadly speaking, but of course it takes different shapes in different places. And despite the eventual triumph of neoliberalism, the peace accords that are negotiated to differing degrees, the post-war settlements, I would say should not be entirely discounted. There's a way in which, read through the lens of today and the neoliberal triumph and the subsequent disintegration of the post-war political economy and states and the disintegration of the post-war democracies, there's a way in which the peace accords can be dismissed as a failure or a sham. But certainly the demilitarization of the states In the case of Guatemala and El Salvador, for example, the establishment of basic civil rights, basic human rights guarantees were no small thing, especially in the Salvadoran case where the guerrillas were able to begin negotiating much earlier from a position of relative strength. Some of those democratic achievements are quite significant at the time. In Guatemala, it was less so, and things happened later. And of course, in Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas were forced out of office after losing a 1990 election, after 10 years of debilitating Contra war, neoliberalism was imposed pretty savagely. But that's just to say that I think it's important to recognize the relative achievements in their context for democracy, while also recognizing how that transition also facilitated this broader process of restructuring that ended up really subsuming the region and subordinating them to these dynamics.
So the peace accords, like Hilary mentioned, they are a triumph. They needed to happen. There was no way that these conflicts would have ended without the sort of diplomatic solution. What to me they actually did in the Guatemalan and the Salvadoran context is, in the Guatemalan context, they actually just cemented the inequalities that could simply not be resolved through the conflict. For example, extractive projects become like a boon, right? In post 1996, where you have hydroelectric projects, damming, logging, right? This becomes a sort of scramble for resources, almost as if capital had been waiting right on the flanks, right, for these conflicts to come to a close. And so that to me is one thing that happens in Guatemala, and on another level too, the racial contradictions, right, of that conflict itself, which now is more or less known as the Guatemalan Civil War and more as the Guatemalan Genocide, precisely because of its ethnic dimensions. And those racial contradictions are not resolved by this opening up to democracy, or a nominal democracy at best. But these problems, right, are cemented. They're in some ways, these peace accords enshrine these inequalities, and they're never resolved. And so they mutate in really perverse ways that become, mass exodus from Central America to the United States, that become then the cycle of deportation back, right? It becomes this whole another economy, in addition to, right, the NGOization of social movements, electoralism as the only way to do politics. Sure, it's a democratic achievement, but it really is a foreclosure of forms of political transformation that no longer have any validity in the new post-war terrain. And so and in the Salvadoran case, is another example of precisely how the peace accords give way. Sure, they needed to happen. The violence was incredible, the brutality, right? We talked about this earlier. The amount of carnage was unprecedented and needed to stop. But what these peace accords also do, right, as a sort of a consequence of them, as a kind of byproduct, let's call it, is precisely, this new sort of informalized displacement that's not coming from an open conflict, but rather from the continual, like, miserable economic conditions of these countries that are still not addressed by these things. They end conflict, right? They demilitarize society. They sort of displace violence in different ways momentarily for elections to happen and things like this. And we'll see how that comes sort of boomerangs back into Central America. But they don't resolve the fundamental contradiction that these struggles in the 1980s into the 1990s attempted to resolve, which was land inequality and the fair share of resources of a nation. This is not resolved. So in fact, in my view, they sort of did politically enshrine these things and make them just even more difficult to disarticulate. They become a struggle around NGOization. They become the struggle against transnational capital. They become, right, the question of deportation and migrant reintegration. They become all these other discrete issues. But fundamentally, the problem of economic inequality that these conflicts attempted to resolve, right, were never achieved.
Right. Exactly. And the material basis for the movements for both reform and insurgency are not only unaddressed, those material conditions are aggravated, and these inequalities are worsened with neoliberal restructuring in many ways. And what neoliberalism does, not only in terms of the packages of reforms that we're all familiar with in terms of structural adjustment of, trade liberalization and privatization and deregulation, but it eliminates the idiom, and ideologically speaking, it makes impossible the vocabulary and the frameworks with which to understand this enduring violence and inequality, as Jorge is saying. And so the terms of struggle are turned inward, they're individualized. We embrace these notions of personal responsibility. Violence is somehow a question of managing personal risk and becomes this sort of abstract social violence of criminality and delinquency rather than political violence with recognizable actors and victims. And so restructuring and so-called democracy also sort of robs people. It's a demobilizing process that also robs people with many of the tools with which to struggle and substitutes them for entrepreneurial, startups and NGOs. And if that fails, a migration project.
One of the things that I'll add too is that, for example, in the Salvadoran case with the Truth Commission, that is part of the 92 Chapultepec peace accords, there's demilitarization and demobilization of weaponry, but that also is a sweeping amnesty law too that allows for, basically killers, right, that a couple of days before, we're killing people rampantly throughout the country that now can't be processed for those crimes. And that creates a sort of incredible psychosocial problem for many of these countries, that there's a culture of impunity, in persistent injustice, right? There's a kind of kicking down the road of all these problems, right? And then they get mutated into these other concerns, but they're never frontally confronted or addressed directly, right? They're not these crimes of the war, right? Of which, in many cases, 90% are perpetrated by the state and by the military and not armed insurgents, never gets addressed, right? This becomes a sort of sacred silence, so to speak, in war-torn Central America and in these post-war societies, that this quote-unquote transition to democracy, which was supposed to give us the equipment and the tools to address through process, through the justice system, fails profoundly.
As we've discussed, a huge number of Central American refugees fled to the United States to get away from violence in the region. Violence fomented, of course, in large part by the United States. 2 street gangs were formed in Los Angeles, Barrio 18 and Mara Salvatrucha. How did the founding of these gangs come about? And then how did these initially modest street gangs, again, of American origin, end up, through deportation policies that took off under the Clinton administration, how did they end up becoming such a catastrophic problem in Central America? How did the Maras ultimately become so large, so violent, so destabilizing to not only El Salvador, but to countries across the region?
So, like you said, the gangs do get started in the 1980s in places like Los Angeles, where it's a bunch of these stoners, people, high schoolers hanging out, punks, chilling with one another, who band together, right, and create organizations, street organizations that are called maras. Maras in Salvadoran speak really just means a group of Salvadorans. That's all it means. And they organize themselves against our pre-existing urban gangs in places like Los Angeles, which are Mexican gangs, right? So Barrio 18, 18th Street, is actually a Mexican gang. And MS-13 is the one that's created in response to that, right? There's an origin story about a girl and that they were dating guys from both gangs, and that's where sort of the beef gets started. But Salvadorans end up going to Los Angeles and, displaced to Los Angeles and entering neighborhoods with primarily Mexican populations, right? And Spanish-speaking populations. And so growing up in communities like that, like MacArthur Park, Pico Union, Echo Park, South LA, right? All these places, it's primarily working class, people of color, Mexican Americans and African Americans. And so the gang really is created in that context as a way to respond to pre-existing street organizations. They become transnationalized through this sort of fear of migrant criminality that we see today, right? That gets thrown around by figures like Trump all the time, and in the sort of boogeyman figure of MS-13 or the gang member, where there's an adoption of rules in places like California, these 3 strikes you're outlaws, where these offenses, whether it be, having some marijuana on you, being, cuffed for fighting somebody, right, become the grounds for deportation. And many of these kids, young men primarily, are deported back to Central America. And this doesn't only happen in the 1990s, but it's towards the tail end of the 1980s, where the deportation machine is already greasing its wheels, and people are being sent back to places like El Salvador and Guatemala, and with no sense of what these countries had been going through. Maybe some sense, of course, but really not embedded in Central American societies. And it's in this context where these gangs also, these people who are part of these gangs, begin to establish new networks in those countries, right, that they've been deported back to as criminals, right? This is not a moment of reinsertion programs and rehabilitating deportees and finding them jobs and connecting them to resources and this kind of thing. I don't think it's that even now. People ended up building those kinds of networks for themselves. But it's in that context of being thrown into a world that you don't know and building new connections with other deportees and other people who speak, sort of that Los Angeles Spanglish, or only English in many cases, right, that create those connections. And already in El Salvador, there's pre-existing gangs too that are connected to local soccer teams and neighborhood gangs that fuse, right, with this kind of Los Angeles gang culture in places like San Salvador, and that explode exponentially and mutate quite a lot in the countries of origin. And the security apparatus of these countries don't know what to do with it, because they're just coming out of a civil war. They're learning how to play democracy. They're more concerned with elections than they are with social issues and investing in working class communities and rebuilding entire towns and things like this. And this becomes a sort of cauldron where gangs begin to take more and more influence, right, in the social terrain of El Salvador. And this breeds that what then will be that kind of repression cycle against gangs that doesn't eradicate them, but in fact accelerates that mutation, that very mutation, their growth, and right, because fundamentally what's not resolved, and I said this earlier, is those economic inequalities that is the breeding ground for this kind of associational culture, one might call it, in the antisocial sense, amongst deported Salvadorans and dispossessed Salvadorans as well.
Right. These refugees who are eventually deported to El Salvador in this sort of emergent post-war landscape are coming back to economies that have been deliberately restructured to create massive labor reserves. What does that mean? They're deliberately restructured not to be able to provide gainful employment for most of the working population. Across Central America, most people are employed in the informal sector. So in this situation, it's not surprising that a significant portion of that informal sector becomes an illicit economy. But that's just to say that there's fertile ground from which these people can recruit disaffected, dispossessed, young people who have been totally excluded from the post-war development model. Initially, these are basically economies of subsistence, petty extortion, street gangs, street sort of criminality. And it's only over time that, as Jorge said, they become more sophisticated precisely in response to these cycles of repression and US-backed strategies of zero tolerance policing, the likes of which, of course, produced these cycles of incarceration and deportation in the first place. And this also sets the precedent for the US style of mass incarceration in the region as a repressive response and solution to these populations of impoverished young people, no?
Let's zero in on the current Central American situation, starting with Salvadoran President Nayib Bukele, a young, world-famous, ruthlessly authoritarian, anti-gang crypto enthusiast. It's hard to know where to begin with Bukele, so let's maybe begin by setting the context for his rise. What path did Salvadoran politics take in the decades after the Civil War? Why did post-war conditions that we've been discussing result in this nightmarish new hegemonic order emerging? The FMLN managed to win power for the decade leading up to Bukele's 2019 victory. Why did FMLN governments fail to sufficiently change the conditions of post-war El Salvador? Why was this period of FMLN governance followed by the extreme law and order victory of Bukele? And it's also worth emphasizing here the depressing reality that Bukele came out of the FMLN.
So it's important to say that following the peace accords, the far right governed in El Salvador for beginning prior to the peace accords, beginning in 1989, the far right governed in El Salvador for 4 consecutive presidential periods. And it's during this time of totally uninterrupted right-wing rule that neoliberalism is imposed, that restructuring is executed, and that the FMLN very slowly is able to sort of get its footing and demobilize its militants and sort of become a functioning political party and slowly make territorial gains at the municipal level, legislative gains, and eventually in 2009 win the presidency. There's a way in which many critiques of Bukele actually sort of accept his premise and frame, or rather posit the FMLN and the far-right Arena party that represents sort of the oligarchy and the new oligarchic bourgeoisie that's born in the post-war period, posits an equivalence between them, blames them both equally for the failures of the post-war, claims that the FMLN accomplished nothing in power, dismisses both as equally corrupt, and then positions Bukele, of course, as the savior, which then critics will say is all false, and supporters will say, thank goodness, now we have Bukele to hopefully lead us out of this mess. I don't agree with that framing. I think it's important to recognize the limits and accomplishments of FMLN governments and all of their contradictions. And we don't have time to do much of any of that. But I encourage people to look into, to consider the social reforms that were implemented under the FMLN, the democratic reforms that were implemented under the FMLN, to consider the great sacrifice and heroism of so many of the FMLN militants and leaders, both in the wartime struggle, but also in the post-war period and in public service, much of which has been erased and slandered subsequently. That said, the shortcomings of the FMLN governance, and indeed the very strategy that allowed them to take power, this strategy of alliances with bourgeois sectors outside of the oligarchy, that is the very strategy that undermined them very clearly in the form of Bukele, because Bukele is the son of a key FMLN financier, important public intellectual Armando Bukele, who had close ties with the Communist Party wing of the FMLN. And so his father, sort of watching Bukele fail in different entrepreneurial ventures, decided to put him into politics. And so Bukele runs as an FMLN mayor in a suburb, and then he's very successful at branding. His family runs a publicity company that ran a lot of the FMLN campaigns very successfully. So Bukele's branding positions him as an ideal candidate to win the mayorship of the capital city in 2015. But Bukele is very ambitious, and when it becomes clear that he's not going to be chosen as the presidential candidate for for the next elections. He increasingly bucks the party leadership. He's expelled by the ethics committee, and he sets out allying with a small far-right party to launch himself into the presidency in 2019. Now, just to close, I think in sort of framing these developments, I would argue that the whole post-war political economy, both in El Salvador and in Central America, by 2009, when the FMLN wins the presidency, is entirely in crisis. Neoliberalism at this point has proven itself an utter failure, even in its own terms of macroeconomic growth. The global financial crisis has hit, and it's starting to impact the region. Central America is hit earlier than a lot of Latin America because remittances fall when the Great Recession hits. So there's this moment of economic crisis and a total loss of neoliberal hegemony that allows this opening that the FMLN is able to enter as this sort of post-neoliberal alternative, as a more social democratic option. And the contradictions and shortcomings of FMLN governance, which are very much also aggravated by very aggressive and US-backed right-wing destabilization that Bukele is then able to sort of expertly leverage to his own gain. But those failures open space for Bukele to posit a much darker and more reactionary and sinister response to this same crisis.
That's a great account of the rise of Bukele and how he uses the FMLN as a sort of favor to his father to get him through the party and use that vehicle for his political career. Very quickly, when he becomes mayor of, I believe it's Nuevo Cuscatlan, right? And then San Salvador, he starts using his own colors and distancing himself from the party, which prompts this whole crisis within the party of whether Bukele is actually one of them, right? But there's, even before this, like there's the FMLN experiences this kind of celebrity type figure as a politician through the figure of Mauricio Funes, right? Who's another politician that doesn't come from the traditional left, is not a historic leader, didn't participate in the struggle, right? And so there's already this kind of experimentation that the FMLN has been attempting, right? And that had yielded electoral victory in 2009, right? And so there's no, they think that they have another Funes on their hands, even though Funes, we can go down that rabbit hole and talk about Funes, but what is clear here is that these strictures that the FMLN is operating in politically, electorally, are precisely, as was said, it's already 20 years of arena governance. Neoliberalism, while it's in crisis, is completely and totally embedded in every facet of social and political life in El Salvador. And these are the conditions that the FMLN, in its first time as a governing force, needs to do politics. And that is a relatively tall order when the game is sort of assembled by a sort of right-wing block for the last 20 years and even before, right? We can talk about the emergence of Fusades in the 1980s as the structural adjustment package and effort for El Salvador. But by the time that the FMLN gets into power, this is a neoliberal system that's fully private, fully deregulated. CAFTA is fully in effect. Austerity measures are policy of the day. This created the conditions for the FMLN to fail as a ruling party. That's not to say that there weren't successes. There were incredible successes at the level of social policy, education, healthcare. There were important successes. But in terms of the actual structure, the political economy of El Salvador, it was already path dependent at that point. There was no way that they would ever undo, right? It would take 40 years to undo the last 20 years in order to actually have any serious kind of lasting alternative policies for the country. And of course, the neoliberal economic crisis of 2008 also impacts through remittances, right? The Salvadoran reality that, again, constrains the FMLN government in different kinds of ways. I remember those elections early on that most of the electoral messaging from the Arena Party towards the FMLN was that if you vote for the FMLN, the remittances are going to stop. That's the only thing they would say. And it was precisely a way of using the global financial crisis, right, to impact and complicate the governance of the FMLN as party in power. And so we can't discount that these failures, right, or these errors of governance, right, had an impact on the political culture and the political ideas of people in El Salvador. There is a sense of a kind of exhaustion, and that cannot be discounted. And from that sort of generalized disaffection in Salvadoran political culture is where this figure of Nayib Bukele sinks his claws, using these false equivalences of Arena being FMLN. They're one of the same, right? He always uses this phrase, creating these narratives, right? That we need to have a clean break from the past, that these two political parties are war criminals, and there's no way to reform them and make them useful in this new context. We need new ideas, right? It's precisely this kind of rhetoric that seizes on this general exhaustion in the Salvadoran people, that while we as, sort of macro level thinkers can understand is part of structural adjustment, a warped political economy of neoliberalism sinking its teeth in every aspect of daily life, from the point of view of people, it just seems like, I'm tired of this, right? I'm tired of this sort of exhaustion that I think also had led to, sort of a Trumpian victory in 2016. And it's precisely that kind of dynamic, right? That we can't live in this repression retaliation cycle that has created this generalized sense of insecurity and criminality and displacement. And this is one of the errors of the FMLN they fall into. They have a security policy that is very, very similar from that of the Arena governments. And that also puts them into a kind of continuum that in some ways makes some of these narratives that Bukele comes up with, which are generally falsified, have some kind of stickiness with the Salvadoran public. And so it's precisely those things that create the conditions for Bukele's rise and his incredible popularity as this kind of novel third way, which is obviously not true, because he represents an emergent bourgeois project and a kind of attempt to integrate himself into the oligarchy. It's precisely this kind of playbook from, the earlier part of episode 1, where we were talking about how the state is a vehicle for personal accumulation. And it's precisely what Bukele is doing, which is what he's going with Bitcoin and, construction and the displacement and gentrification of the capital city. This is just a new sort of narrative justification for that same personalist project of attempting to become a new elite in El Salvador, right? By trampling down all political efforts before it. But something like, with the FMLN, they did have an ambitious social agenda, but they were also constrained by all these debt instruments that come, post 1990 with the IMF and the World Bank, structural adjustment and conditional loans that they have to pay back. And so there's all sorts of issues, right, that are inherited from those Arena governments past that just from the outset cripple the FMLN effort. And while there are governance errors, no doubt, the conditions in which they govern is something that was not created by them, yet they had to deal with and struggle with, which in the end impacted what they were able to achieve.
That's right. And the FMLN is not only constrained by, these financial instruments, constant US threats to funding and aid, but of course, by the balance of powers and the rule of law of this post-war institutionality, a reactionary Supreme Court that rules every FMLN reform unconstitutional, a legislature that starves the government of funding sources. And Bukele learned the lesson of that experience very well by essentially abolishing that division of powers entirely. Bukele comes in and he fires the Supreme Court. He fires the Attorney General. He unlawfully replaces them. He restructures the legislature to reduce the number of seats. He restructures the entire map of the country to reduce the number of municipalities, to erase the jurisdictions where the FMLN retains or was regaining support at the local level, and thus sort of entirely destroys what remained of that post-war democracy. And I think it's really with Bukele that the crisis of that institutionality, which was already evident under the FMLN, is sort of culminated. And we enter this new period of the post-war, which is sort of pre-liberal in many ways. And as Jorge is suggesting, is the crisis of these neoliberal accumulation patterns. We start seeing this return to extractivism in a much more robust way across the region, this sort of shift towards rentier economies, these land grabs and real estate speculation, abdication entirely of any kind of developmental project for the working majorities.
So over the past 4 years of his government, how under Bukele has this process of law and order, mano dura repression, the resulting imposition of a brutal but real form of public order, and then this hegemonic consolidation, how has that played out?
So in the last, government of Bukele, one of his crown achievements, and he says this, is that he eliminated the gangs, right? He eliminated the gangs. And we can't discount this. We can't discount this as having real qualitative effects on people's everyday life, right? This is something that Bukele has been expert in disseminating using his, social media and all of this. This is not to say that the way he's doing it is the problem, right? And this is the dismantling of all country institutionality, remaking the state in his image, authoritarian consolidation. But this is precisely why people see in El Salvador, at least, based on, we've talked about Hernandez Martinez in the 1930s and these other figures, for some segments of the Salvadoran population, this is perceived as effective governance, right? This kind of caudillismo is seen as effective governance in places like Central America, and to this day. And Bukele comes in that kind of long line of political leadership that uses these strong arm methods to give quote unquote results, even though those results criminalized everybody in the country, prevented people from going out onto the streets in groups of more than 6, I think it was, or something like that, for many years, especially during the pandemic, right? Utilized the pandemic as a sort of justification to remilitarize society. These things that he's been doing in the remilitarization of Salvadoran society, while it has all these institutional effects, right, and decays the fragile democracy that remained, like Hilary said, fired all judges, gerrymandered El Salvador in order to allow his party to have full control of the legislative assembly. It's these things that Salvadorans aren't quite privy to. They're not seeing that. From the post-war, from 1992 to the present, most people are living day by day. They're living a reality where the future has been denied them, even as a sort of exercise of imagination, right? Because of the levels of insecurity, because of the violence, because of the future actually being located elsewhere in the global north and not in El Salvador. And it's that kind of thing that's really latched onto, right, the Salvadoran consciousness as being effective governance, even though what it really is, right, is a dismantling of all democratic levers and constitutionality, And so it's this kind of quagmire that Salvadorans find themselves in, even though it's a false one, right? It's a false one, because there are other forms that were never explored in order to quell that social insecurity that plagued the country since the post-war, that were underexplored. Because the country ended up just taking on, right, repression and retaliation as the only way forward. Punitivism became, that issue that one could not vacillate on, any president. And we talked about the FMLN as being also binded, right, by that premise. And Bukele continues this, right? He leans into it, in fact. But what we already are seeing is that this war against gangs, as he called it, at first he called it territorial control plan, and now it's the war against gangs. I don't know what it'll be tomorrow. But what we see is that it's unsustainable, right? You can't incarcerate your way out of this crisis. The building of this new prison, which is part and parcel of a new accumulation strategy for this government and for Bukele as a person and his family. This is an unsustainable situation. You can't do this. Because, again, also people are still migrating at numbers as high as before the pandemic. And so even Bukele's security achievements, right, haven't stemmed those issues. They haven't impacted them at all. Because, again, go back to the sort of sacred silence. We can't talk about land redistribution, economic inequality, a post-neoliberal order. Can't talk about policies and politics that look beyond that sort of free trade world that Central America is always supposed to serve to the global economy.
Right. Just to recap, Bukele imposes a state of exception under the pandemic. It provokes a constitutional crisis and is sort of the rehearsal for the permanent state of exception to come. By 2021, after he has imposed Bitcoin as legal tender, which is massively unpopular in a country that has already been dollarized and doesn't have its own currency since 2001, that measure is a spectacular failure. By 2021, Bukele is actually beginning to lose popularity, and there's massive marches, both against Bitcoin and also in defense of the peace accords, against Bukele's discursive and obviously material attacks on both their legacy and materiality. Bukele responds in the spring of 2022 with the state of exception in the context of the apparent fracture of a secret pact that he had negotiated with the gang leadership to keep homicides low. When that falls apart, they respond with this state of exception and a regime of mass incarceration, which to this date has seen maybe 100,000 arrests without evidence, the suspension of constitutional rights to due process, suspension of rights to attorney, to prison visits and families. Hundreds of people have died behind bars, and it has been renewed for going on 3 years. So the 2024 elections, while they took place in a context of a state of exception for the first time since the Civil War, and they took place amid these massive electoral reforms that totally changed the rules of the game. Even under those conditions, and it should be said that Bukele's reelection is also entirely unconstitutional. There's at least 6 different articles of the Constitution that expressly forbid presidential reelection, consecutive terms. Even then, Bukele, his legislators and his mayors received significantly fewer votes than he did. So it's also not true that there is a uniform enthusiasm among the Salvadoran public for one-party rule. And Bukele has been very reluctant to put his agenda to a popular vote. While the Salvadoran Constitution doesn't allow for referendums, it doesn't allow for re-elections either. And Bukele has not tried to hold a referendum, for example, on his re-election or on many of these unpopular reforms like Bitcoin, like the state of exception. Instead, he has consistently unilaterally imposed his agenda from above and then bolstered support through propaganda. But like Jorge said, I mean, people, and this is true of supporters of any far-right regime, people are not dumb. People are not just mindless fools and victims of expert propaganda. While Bukele's media machine is very successful and savvy, people are responding to real material conditions. And I think the sense is that as long as the apparent gains, the apparent relief from the street level extortion and harassment from the street gangs holds, people are somewhat willing to tolerate the rollback of their rights. That can only go on for so long, but of course now the question is, what avenues remain to contest Bukele from below? And the answer is very few.
That was part 2 of our now 3-part series on Central America with Hilary Goodfriend and Jorge Cuéllar. Stay tuned for part 3. Hilary Goodfriend is a postdoctoral researcher with the Geography Institute at the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City. She's a member of the editorial committee of the North American Congress on Latin America, NACLA, an editor of the journal Latin American Perspectives, and a contributing editor at Jacobin Magazine. Jorge Cuéllar is professor of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies at Dartmouth College. He's an interdisciplinary scholar whose research and teaching focuses on the histories, politics, and daily life of modern Central America. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also now Instagram at thedigradio. And do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, please take a moment to rate and review us. Those ratings and reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really does that is you telling people that you know, IRL, online, wherever, to check out this podcast. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.